So, okay, so here we go. Good evening. Hello there. You're just going to have to excuse this kind of makeshift live stream that I'm doing on my computer here. Thank you very much for joining us. As you can see, I am with Brett Best. Brett Best will be giving our talk tonight on social media, e-professionalism and sign language interpreters. A little bit about Brett, for those of you who don't know her. Brett is one of our few qualified ASL, BSL interpreters in the country. So very special person, I think, like a growing number here. Graduated from Gallaudet University. So it's a real honour to have her here with us tonight. I've seen her present before. She's fantastic. I'm looking forward to this live web stream. So thank you very much, Brett. I'm going to just put your slide up. Are you ready to go?
Right.
Yeah? Lovely.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Rob. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to present here this evening on social media, e-professionalism, and sign language interpreters. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on this Friday evening. I think that this topic is very interesting and it's becoming increasingly more pertinent. As Rob has said, my name is Brett Best. I am an interpreter and I'm a social media user. My Twitter hashtag is at the bottom of this screen. And you're free to ask any questions you'd like at the end. Just let us know what you'd like to ask. I think a lot of people nowadays have varying opinions on social media and sign language interpreters and what is okay to post and what shouldn't be posted. And although I have my own opinions, my objective tonight is not to offer you a lot more opinions, but hopefully provide some theoretical concepts that will lay the groundwork for some very constructive dialogue within our profession about professional social media usage. And I also have some research on the topic that I'd like to present tonight. So let's get started. Where are we going this evening? First of all, I'll present the learning objectives because this is an opportunity to earn structured CPD. I'll then give a brief introduction, and then I'll go on to the theoretical concepts which underpin a lot of professional social media usage currently being discussed in the literature and what current research has found on that, and then I'll go into my own research findings, and then we can do a Q&A. So the learning objectives for this evening are that after viewing this presentation, participants will be able to define e-professionalism, identify theoretical constructs for professional social media usage, such as small world ethics and anonymous work, identify at least one challenge that social media brings to the profession, and identify at least one benefit that social media brings to the profession. I expect there'll probably be several others that are identified as well, but at least one is a pretty safe bet. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about how I became interested in social media. I think that like many of us, I saw some things on social media that gave me pause and made me wonder, but specifically, I had gone to an international conference where there were several sign language interpreters present. And when I got on the plane to come home, I landed and I realized that on Facebook, an interpreter who had attended the conference had made a post on their Facebook wall about two of the interpreters who'd been working at the conference. And that post tagged several of the interpreters who were there at the conference. Now, there were people from about 3 different continents that were tagged. But what really struck me was that in less than 24 hours, that post had been commented on by people from 5 of the 7 continents. And considering that one of them is not inhabited, that was pretty impressive to me. But what really struck me was the last comment, the comment that ended the entire thread. And that was someone very far away who said, I am not an interpreter, but I am reading this because my friend who was tagged in this post is an interpreter. I don't know anything about interpreting, but after reading this thread, I'm really beginning to wonder. And that really struck me because in less than 24 hours, this post had covered the entire globe and left someone with a very negative impression of our profession. And I thought, wow, this is something that as a profession, we really need to start looking at. So I started looking at it. And the most interesting thing I found was that most of the research that's been done on professional social media usage has been done in the medical field. In fact, other researchers have acknowledged this and have said, healthcare is the most advanced in grappling with the changed nature of practice and the ethical challenges that brings to the profession. This is interesting because the medical field is a practice profession. And if you're familiar with the work of Dean and Pollard, you'll know that they also call interpreting a practice profession. We work with people. So as interpreters, it may be very useful for us to look at the medical profession and what they have found with social media usage and fostering professional social media usage and seeing if we can apply that to the interpreting field as well. Now, towards that endeavor, I have identified several interesting concepts in the literature, which I'd like to share tonight, which I hope will become that groundwork for constructive discussions in the future. And those concepts are E-Professionalism, the concept of small world ethics, the idea that a new online culture is developing, and anonymous work and promotion. This section that I'm about to present is currently being prepared for publication in an article of the next edition of the Journal of Interpretation. It's an academic essay, and that should be available online whenever that comes out, hopefully pretty soon. So the first concept is E-Professionalism, and it was coined by researchers Kane and Romanelli in 2009. And it's defined as the attitudes and behaviors, some of which may occur in private settings, reflecting traditional professionalism paradigms that are manifested through digital media, displayed through photos, videos, online group affiliations, discussion board posts, and other forms of digital representations, which are cues and signals that define one's online persona. Now, basically, what this is essentially means is it's just the traditional values of professionalism, but manifested in the digital domain. And it's different, even though it's the same values of traditional professionalism, it's different for a few reasons. First of all, online, there is an increased overlap between personal and professional realms. And secondly, the online persona is a new thing. And it's important because researchers have found that what happens online can affect public perception of both the individual professional as well as the profession at large, because many times a professional is seen as representing an entire profession. So online behavior has potentially a huge impact both on an individual and the profession. That's the first concept. The second concept I'd like to look at is small world ethics. And this is a really interesting concept. So it has to do with the overlap of personal and professional domains online. These researchers, Lannon and Scott, said essentially what happens on social media is you have a small world environment because of this amplified overlap of these two realms. But they said, actually, we know how to handle this already because there's some professions who've been handling this in a very traditional sense for a very long time. And they say, this is a small world environment. We can look at those professionals who've been working in a small world environment, and they pinpoint rural psychologists. So psychologists working in very small communities. And they say that in a rural environment, there is greater transparency, increased self-disclosure, and unavoidable multiple relationships. But boundary violations may not necessarily be unmanageable. However, they do require careful prevention and management. And at the core of this is this idea of multiple relationships, overlapping relationships. So an example of this would be if you are a psychologist working in a rural environment, you may have a child who is friends with a child who's one of your clients, or maybe you go to the pub and you see a lot of your clients there, or you go to the church and you see a lot of your clients there. So there's a lot of this overlap, but they say these psychologists know how to handle that. That's a small world environment. We can look to see how they manage those boundaries to do the same on social media. In this upcoming essay, I ask are sign language interpreters similar to rural psychologists already? If you think about sign language interpreters, they may often have deaf family members, so there's some immediate potential overlapping relationships. And those of us who don't have deaf family members are often encouraged to socialize in the deaf community for the benefits it begets language and cultural acquisition. And if that participation is genuine, then you would expect friendships to develop, and that potentially leads to an overlapping relationships. So it's interesting to think about whether sign language interpreters may have been traditionally practicing in a small world environment anyway. If that is the case, what happens when you take somebody practicing in a small world environment, such as a rural psychologist, or maybe even a sign language interpreter perhaps, and put them on social media? Does that mean that you get an even smaller world environment? Perhaps. The next concept I'd really like to look at is this idea that there's a new online culture developing. There's two ways of looking at this. The first is digital natives versus digital immigrants, and the other is digital fluency. But I will look at the first way of conceptualizing the potential of a new online culture developing. Digital natives and digital immigrants are terms that were coined by a guy named Prensky in 2001, and he basically says that those who were born into this age of technology tend to adopt the technology more quickly. They tend to be more adept with it, more comfortable with it, and use it more often. And there's some research that says that there's new social norms developing online. So new social norms that reward disclosure are already in place among the young, and the millennial generation will lead society into a new world of personal disclosure and information sharing using social media. So perhaps younger generations are using social media in a different way. Other research has found that active social networkers, who are those who spend around 30% of their day or more on social networking sites, which is a lot, they're more likely to be under 30 years of age and more likely to publicly comment about professional situations at work. I didn't list it here, but they're also more likely to create content than passively view it. And other research has found that the more time which is spent on social networking sites is linked to professionally unacceptable or questionable online behavior. So these are just some thoughts that have to do with perhaps the development of a new online culture. The opposite of the digital natives versus digital immigrants framework, or a different framework, I should say, is this idea of digital fluency, which basically says it doesn't matter what generation you were born into. What matters is your ability to use the digital media. Are you willing to accept it? How well do you learn about it? How often do you use it, regardless of your digital generation? This concept embraces more ideas like society is still trying to figure out what's okay online because it's still developing, and that online culture is a participatory culture. So it's determined and shaped by those who participate in it, regardless of their digital generation. Now, all these frameworks are interesting because when you start looking at guidelines for social media usage, you kind of start to see some interesting assumptions. For example, the International Association of Conference Interpreters, IEC, issued some social media guidelines in 2012. IEC is mostly a spoken language interpreter association for conference interpreters, but they do have 2 sign language interpreters in their ranks now. When they issued these guidelines, the guiding principle was common sense. It's interesting to think about if we have different demographics using social media differently, is it enough to rely on common sense as a guiding principle when we may have new social norms developing? It's just something interesting to think about. The next concept that I'd like to introduce for consideration is this idea of anonymous work. This was put forth by Zweig in 2014 in a book entitled The Invisibles. Now, I think this is kind of an unfortunate name for a book because we all know that interpreters aren't invisible, right? But he doesn't mean it in the way that interpreters are just these neutral language transfer conduits. He doesn't mean that kind of invisible. What he's saying is that some jobs are less noticed the more flawlessly they are done. And essentially, these types of jobs are enabling a larger objective, so it's not about the person doing that job. For example, he says, if you go and you watch a professional pianist play at a concert, you don't think about the person who tunes the piano. That would be a type of anonymous work, the piano tuner. He actually also mentions interpreters, and he interviews a UN interpreter in his book. He says interpreting is anonymous work because it's accomplishing a greater objective and it's not about the interpreter. Furthermore, he says that these kind of jobs do not mesh well with the look at me culture of social media. So here he's saying there is a different kind of culture of social media. It's a very much look at me type of culture, and that these types of jobs of anonymous work just don't fit with it, specifically including interpreting. Now, this is a really interesting concept. However, it's also interesting to think about the fact that a lot of sign language interpreters are freelancers. Downey recently wrote a book on adding value as an interpreter, how to be an excellent interpreter, and says to be a freelance professional interpreter means being a business. And oftentimes freelancers are told they have to build a personal brand and promote their expertise and differentiate themselves. So how does this mesh with the concept of interpreters and anonymous work? It's interesting to think about. So with all these theoretical constructs in mind, I decided I wanted to do some research, and I decided to focus on Facebook. And the reason that I focused on Facebook is because it is the social media platform it's the biggest one in the world, both in terms of numbers of active users and global reach. So I wanted to see how sign language interpreters perceive social media, such as Facebook, is being used by other interpreters. I wanted to get some ideas of what was happening out there. So I held focus groups, and I chose focus groups because they're very good at generating a lot of data because there's a synergy of responses, except the focus groups I held looked a lot more like this because I did them on Skype. I will explain why I did them on Skype in a minute. The requirements were just that somebody was a sign language interpreter and a current Facebook user. There were plenty of people who came forward and said they were no longer Facebook users for various professional reasons, but I wanted to know what was currently happening and perspectives on what was currently happening, so I made it a requisite that they were current Facebook users. And the reason I used Skype was because it facilitated the international aspect of this study. Facebook is an international platform. In fact, even though it was started in the United States, something like over 80-something% of its users are outside of the US and Canada. So it's very much a global phenomenon, so I wanted to get a little bit of a global perspective. I had 4 interpreters from the US, 4 from the UK, and 4 from Denmark. They were all hearing. And each focus group was 60 to 80 minutes and was semi-structured. So that meant I did have some prompt questions based in the literature, but it was mostly a very free-flowing discussion to see what naturally emerged. I transcribed everything verbatim and put it into a software called In Vivo, where I identified themes as either directly relevant to the literature or discussed by 2 groups. And the reason why it's important it was discussed by at least 2 groups is because if one of the groups didn't discuss it, it may be country specific, which I did find some things that were very country specific, which was interesting. And then I did a content designation analysis, which is basically explains or kind of indicates what the most pertinent themes were. This is my research group composition, which you may be interested in. All research participants filled in a basic data form that asked these questions. Well, not all of them. It was offered to all of them. 11 of the 12 turned it in. I think there's some really interesting things here when we're looking at this. All of them were Facebook friends with other interpreters, and all of them were Facebook friends with deaf people or people with links to the deaf community. which is really interesting because you start thinking about concepts such as small world ethics and overlapping relationships, and you start wondering if any of that starts coming into play. 10 of them were Facebook friends with clients, and 1 was not. Of those 10 who was Facebook friends with clients, he or she only said that they were friends with previous clients but not current clients. So this is just some basic background information on who participated in these studies. The major findings of this research were that there were definite perceived overlap of personal and professional domains, but there were several boundary management strategies that were utilized. And although there were several challenges that were mentioned in regard to Facebook, the one that came up is definitely being the strongest perceived challenge was that of confidentiality. We also looked specifically at self-promotion and event presence, which I'll explain a little bit further later. And then we looked at the benefits of social media, such as Facebook. So it's interesting to look at the boundary management strategies because there was a perceived overlap of personal versus professional realms. And some of the comments on that overlap are interesting. As this British participant said, I think there's an overlap between personal and professional personas because of how it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a community we're involved in, so we do have deaf friends as well as clients and colleagues. This was a pretty common refrain, which may give a little bit of credence to the idea of small world ethics, that maybe these how it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's a community we're involved in, so we do have deaf friends as well as clients and colleagues. This was a pretty common refrain, which may give a little bit of credence to the idea of small world ethics, that maybe these types of overlapping relationships are existing offline. And then we need to think about perhaps what happens when they're put online. Strategies for managing this type of overlap was just self-monitoring of posts, exercising reserve with certain opinions or content, which you might expect, but also creating professional spaces via posting certain things only in designated groups. So not only do we have personal versus professional individual boundaries, there's also strategies that interpreters are reporting using for professional space. They're creating boundaries around professional spaces by creating these groups. Another strategy I thought was really interesting was posting only personal content or all or mostly professional content. And that was a very interesting strategy for me because there has been some research in the medical field, again, by some researchers named Clyde Rodriguez and Geyser back in 2014. And what they did is they created some physician Facebook profiles, some of which had only professional content, some of which had only personal content, and some which had a mix of both, but different kinds of personal content. And they theorized that those that had only professional content would actually be perceived as more professional. But what they found in this study was that those profiles that had some personal content were actually perceived as more professional as long as it was healthy personal content, i.e. not excessive drinking or sexually explicit photos or anything like that. And from this, they posited that perhaps having some personal content gives people enough of an indication about one's character in order to draw inferences, whereas only professional content did not. Now that's just some interesting findings from a completely separate study. I cannot apply them to this study at all. That's not something that I explicitly looked for. But it is a little interesting aside that I think of whenever I see these strategies mentioned. The next finding was that of confidentiality, and this came up very strongly. In fact, towards the end of the focus groups, I asked, what challenges do you feel Facebook brings to the profession? But by far, this issue came up way before I ever even asked that explicit question. In a content designation analysis, references to confidential or confidentiality came up over 40 times, whereas by comparison, the next most common theme talked about which was explicitly asked about. Promotion only came up 17 times. So this is definitely a very strong issue for the interpreters in this study. And it was illustrated specifically in regards to location check-ins. So like one interpreter said, they don't even think about the check-in. Well, now I know where you are working because I know that there are 3 deaf people that work in that 3-block radius. People don't realize how people can put the pieces together. And essentially it's just about people connecting the dots. And in a very small community, there is a high chance of deductive disclosure just because people are able to make inferences. As this interpreter said, I've seen people post things of every shade of gray, from right down to I can make a really good 90% guess of who you are working with today, to more subtle things. And I think what this shows is small world ethics. Essentially, we work in a very small community, and little bits of information, even when they're not intended to violate confidentiality, can very easily allow people to draw inferences about where or who an interpreter is working with. The next interesting finding from this research was self-promotion. Now, given the concepts that Zweig puts forth about anonymous work, I wanted to know about self-promotion. I asked if interpreters saw any examples of self-promotion on Facebook, and if so, what did they think about that? And I think this interpreter summed it up very well and said, part of the reason people are on social media is not just to communicate and keep in touch with people. It's to build up a persona, to spin a story about who you are. Look at me, I'm an amazing interpreter. Here's me with, I think he said Stephen Fry. It's quite hard to avoid being sucked into that. Yeah, I had to actually take out the name Stephen Fry, because I was like, if I'm writing this for a huge international audience, I have to. Is it bad if I don't know who Stephen Fry is?
He's a big name.
Okay.
He's a very big
I figured he must be. Anyway, I think this interpreter has a good point, that it is kind of hard to avoid being sucked into that. But again, if we look at freelancing as a business, what do we feel about this? So I did wonder about that. What was most interesting to me is that I did frame this as self-promotion, but a very interesting distinction came up during the discussions, which I will get to in a minute. But the first thing that came up that was very interesting was this idea of what I call implicit self-promotion, which is very different than what I think could be framed as explicit self-promotion, which I will explain later. But implicit self-promotion was explained by this participant as, to some extent, one of the reasons I share a lot of publications, conferences, events, and things like that is because it reflects positively on me as a professional interpreter. So this is just a general, basic professionalism. This, I believe, is a little bit different than what I was wondering about, which came up as what I'm classifying as event presence. And here's where a very interesting distinction emerged. There was a distinction made between event promotion, as in accessibility promotion, and posting, an interpreter posting about their presence at an event during or after the fact. Now, it's important to say that these events are public events, and the interpreters in the study didn't feel like that was in any way breaking confidentiality because these are public events. As far as event promotion is concerned, the American group and the British group mentioned music festivals, basically saying, if an interpreter was saying, I will be interpreting at this event, and just so you know, it is now accessible, that was generally deemed favorably. There was some, kind of became a little bit gray when an interpreter was posting during or after the fact. And I can't say that it was necessarily deemed unethical, but whether or not it was professional was up for question. It was described with adjectives like icky and uncomfortable. But the interesting thing is some of the interpreters said, well, maybe it's not about a look at me type of thing. Maybe it's more of a geek out moment. Like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I've got the coolest job ever. I can't believe I'm here. But what wasn't clear is if even the intent was coming from that vein, even if it was more of a geek out moment, so to speak, if that would make it anyhow perceived in a different manner. If you look at Zweig's premise of anonymous work, he would say, well, the work's not about the interpreter, and therefore it wouldn't matter if it was a geek out moment or not. But I think I can't say anything definitive based on the research that I did about how these types of posts were perceived, and that needs more research. But in sum, there was a difference in perception when a post was event-centric and posted for clearly non-self-serving reasons, as in the vein of accessibility, as opposed to interpreter-centric and posted during or after the fact. And again, this really needs a lot more research because the research that I did wasn't conclusive on perceptions of this. I think it would be very interesting to look at how consumers perceive these types of posts and not just interpreters. So a lot of times when we're looking at event presence, we're talking about photos and videos. And so I was really curious to see a lot of talk about photos and videos come up. A lot of interpreters said this is something that was on their mind, and it's very easy for a photo or a video to go viral. Or, you know, things get posted online of interpreters without them giving their permission, without them knowing. And so they have a lot less control of their online professional persona in that way. As far as posting these themselves, one Danish participant said, if someone is taking pictures of what's going on to go on the page of the Deaf Association, it's different than if I ask someone else to take a picture of me and the person I'm interpreting for or with, and I put it up on my Facebook page. And this was a common feeling throughout all the groups, that they felt if an interpreter posted something, it was perhaps less acceptable than if somebody at the event posted something of the interpreter. Both the Danish and American groups gave anecdotes of an interpreter asking a deaf client for permission to post something online. And when that client gave permission, they then posted it, which this was seen as more acceptable. However, it's also interesting to think about when people are looking at these posts online, they may not know that permission was given by the client. So this is something interesting to think about and perhaps do some more research on. And when you're thinking about why there may be a difference, I think this British participant summed it up very well and said, I think for me, one of the biggest things I've noticed is where it starts creating power and control issues in my head of figuring out who's putting what where for what reason. If a deaf person posts a picture of you while they have been working with you because they were necessarily in charge of the job, I don't struggle with that so much because actually that's them making the decision. So that's interesting to think about. By far, interpreters felt there were far more benefits of using Facebook and social media than there were drawbacks. And this included like awareness of information and events, professional development and networking, which has also been found in the literature, assignment preparation. So a lot of interpreters said they would use Facebook to just see who they were working with the next day, to see if they could, just so they'd recognize them, or see if that person had any videos posted to see their signing style, or just know what had been going on in their life in case it came up in conversation, how to spell names, etc. It was also very good for problem solving. Interpreters said that because of that personal overlap, they had more knowledge about their coworkers. So for example, if there was a knitting class that needed an interpreter, you might know from someone's Facebook page if they enjoy knitting, and then you know they're the perfect interpreter for that job. Or you might know that they're Jewish and they'd be great for the synagogue assignment that's come up. So that personal professional overlap is not always a bad thing. It did actually convey some benefits. And then it was also very good, perceived as being very good for implicit self-promotion. And again, implicit self-promotion was something seen as something to leverage that interpreters should really try and take advantage of. So there's a lot of applications for this research, and specifically in regard to interpreting. I think the most interesting thing is that a lot of research done in the medical field has found that just raising awareness of e-professionalism really is very effective in fostering greater e-professionalism. This is interesting because in the medical field, There's been calls for greater e-professionalism education, and a lot of medical degree programs are beginning to incorporate e-professionalism. In their guidelines, IEC also called on the interpreting field to incorporate e-professionalism training. And the most interesting thing from this study, I think, was the Danish group. The Danish group is the only group in this study who reported a perceived decrease in unprofessional posts over the past couple years. And the reason why this is really interesting is because the Danish group is also the only group who reported a explicit e-professionalism training. So the interpreters in this study, one of them had just graduated recently, within the past 2 years, and said that she actually had a lesson on e-professionalism, which she found was very useful because she hadn't really given it much thought before that. And they all had worked for agencies which brought in consultants to talk on professionalism. So from here, I think that if there is a changing culture, we need to think about how we bring e-professionalism into that culture online. I think there needs to be a lot more research to see how interpreters are using social media, how clients and other interpreters perceive it. This really just scratches the surface. There's so much to look at. And if we are in a participatory culture, like Fuchs says, then we're in a very unique place to shape the concept of e-professionalism for sign language interpreters going forward. This quote is interesting to me. This quote is by some people working in the medical field that said, some of the online content that has been identified as unprofessional in the medical field may not clearly violate existing principles. And I find that really interesting because it makes you wonder who are the ones who've identified content as unprofessional and who created that content. And if it doesn't clearly violate existing principles and e-professionalism is based on the traditional values of professionalism, then what principles are we looking at? I think there's a lot to be defined within our own profession of what we want to see, what we expect to see as professional behavior online. I think the best way we can start to do that is by having dialogue on the topic and more research. Hopefully this has given some groundwork for, or just a framework for what can begin to be some very constructive dialogue on the topic. And I'd be really interested in hearing what anybody has to say about it or any questions that there may be.
Thank you very much. That was very good. I mean, we've had quite a few discussions. I don't know if you could hear me typing to the side of here, because quite a few people have been writing in a few thoughts. One was Jill Behenna, who asked, did anyone mention challenging colleagues' posts, for example, on confidentiality?
Yes, this is interesting. I'm glad that question was asked, because if you're looking at the concept of a participatory culture where you shape what's happening online, you would want to know if people were challenging things like that, because that's how you would shape the online culture. And I did ask about that. And it was interesting because some people said they had, or they knew of people who had. And so there was some reports that, yes, they were responding and they were saying things.
Hang on, bear with me, because I just think it would be nicer for everyone if they could see you. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, that's better, isn't it? They can see us both. Okay, lovely. So when you were talking about before about how IEC had set up some guidelines, I thought to myself, oh, is that another opportunity for ASLI to speak to IEC and say, hey, can we work together so we can develop some guidelines? Have you thought about doing something like that, or? I
think it's interesting. I think it would be very useful to set up some guidelines. And I think they need to be guidelines instead of rules.
Guidelines, right.
Because I think it's very difficult to say, like we've just seen, it's very difficult to say, okay, do not ever post anything about a job ever, when we have seen that if interpreters are posting about perhaps a public festival that may not have ever been interpreted before and they're letting people know it will be interpreted, that's something we might want to think about. But then it gets very sticky. It gets very gray.
Right. Right.
Researchers have also found that it's very difficult to set hard and fast rules for social media usage because the technology is evolving and changing so quickly. But I think guidelines would probably be a good idea.
I think Jill's quite rightly pointed out, then those who challenge probably get unfriended. Right? So I guess the other part to that is then you end up co-working with them somewhere,
yeah,
right?
You show up with them somewhere. And you say, oh, I don't know what you've been up to lately because I couldn't see your Facebook page. But I think also, I think it's about raising awareness. So if we begin to have a dialogue where we're developing a common set of expectations, and these are made very clear through ongoing dialogue, then that person may unfriend someone. But if there is an ongoing dialogue, they may become more and more aware of what is expected.
I mean, just thinking about this, because I remember, I think I was a late joiner on social media, but when I joined, I noticed there were interpreters being cancelled, going shopping. So it's a bit similar to what the question that Jill was asking. But what I thought was interesting was people were saying, "Hey, that's not appropriate behaviour, right?" So we're actually able to resolve this ourselves online.
I think we can if we become proactive with it. I also think, though, that maybe if it's not challenged consistently or not challenged enough, it could become the norm.
Sure.
In some ways.
Sure. Okay. Gail Dixon, she's pointed out that ASLIA, so the Association of Sign Language Interpreters Australia, Victoria, has guidelines on social media. And she actually raised the issue with NRCPD, and their stance is that it's down to the profession to look into this and to develop guidelines.
That's interesting.
Why is that interesting?
Well, I think they're a regulator, aren't they?
So you think it should be there?
I don't know if I want to say it should be regulated. I do feel like it is a professional issue, and I think it would be good for ASLI to perhaps take the initiative on drafting some guidelines, just to foster that common understanding.
Right. So on what grounds could a complaint be upheld? That's
very difficult. I think if something clearly breaks a tenet, such as confidentiality. But the one thing that my research showed, it's very difficult sometimes to determine what is not professional and what actually does break confidentiality. Because it could be deductive disclosure. There could be enough information there where you can infer several things about an assignment or a client, but it's very hard to back up a proof.
And there are pictures of me up there that I didn't take or put up there, but people have just taken and announced my presence.
Well, I think that's something you don't have any control over, right? And that's one of the things about social media that's a little bit unnerving, because you don't have full control over your online professional persona. Now,
there's another point here. Carol Reese-Williams, she's saying, I'm interested on clients, deaf people's, capital D, big D, deaf people's attitudes to self-promotion. Is there any research about this? And do you mean self-promotion by interpreters? So
yes.
How do they feel when they see interpreters promoting themselves online?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that's really important to look into, and I'm planning to do some research on that. Probably with some vignette methodology, where you sort of like take a hypothetical post. So to look at self-promotion, but maybe also look at some of the things you've mentioned, like interpreters saying, oh, wow, I just got off early, and now I'm just sitting here drinking a coffee. You know, just kind of get a feel for perceptions.
I mean, this makes me think of a conversation that I've had with a group of interpreters where we talked about self-promotion. And when you look at media professionals, they're constantly online self-promoting, going, hey, I'm on this job, I'm filming here, I'm with so-and-so. And that's a really important part of their work, to keep getting that kind of work. So
I think it is interesting because, like Downey has said in his recent book on adding value as an interpreter, it's important to brand yourself and to differentiate. How do you do that?
Right.
It's a very sticky question. I do not pretend to have any answers, right. But I think that as a profession, we need to come up with these answers collectively. Like, what do we want to see? What do we want to have happen?
what would you like to see happen? So Rachel Mapson has asked, did you find any difference in attitude depending on the age of your participants?
That's really interesting because I didn't notice any, but the American group definitely began to talk about a difference in how older interpreters and younger interpreters use social media. I didn't report on that because it was they didn't go into it in a lot of detail. I didn't feel like there was enough data there for me to be able to draw any specific conclusions, but it is something that, and none of the other groups mentioned it, but it was something that briefly came up and I think is probably worthy of looking into further, especially when we think about training and education and the next generation of interpreters coming up. And if we have traditionally been working in a small world ethical environment, you might wonder how are interpreters who honed their skills in that small world ethical environment in the traditional sense, bringing those skills to social media? Are they? Secondly, do younger interpreters have access to their profiles? Can they see how they're dealing with these things? Are they even conscious of how these things are dealt with? So it raises a lot of interesting questions.
So there's some thoughts saying that we do need to look at developing guidelines because it needs to be it kind of needs to be mapped out because what one person thinks is okay, another doesn't.
Exactly.
So that's the benefit of guidelines.
I think that would be a shared understanding, and this is the thing that the Danish interpreters had because they had number one, there's a very small group of interpreters in Denmark comparatively. And these interpreters in my study specifically had said that there was a lot of awareness in their country about what was expected on social media. And they brought in a lot of people to talk about it. And they kind of developed this shared understanding of what was okay and what was not. But I think the hard thing is too, it's really hard to have anything black and white because there will always be things that are a little bit gray. But if we can have a shared understanding of certain basic principles, it makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I suppose as interpreters, we get to kind of, you're not going to post the fact that you're doing a GP appointment, but there are certain jobs that kind of provoke you into.
I think it's the public jobs, the ones that are public events. So you can say, I'm not breaking confidentiality because it's public, and it's something noteworthy or with a notable individual. And like this one participant in the research said, there's something about people on social media. It's a look at me culture on social media, and people just naturally want to, I think, kind of say, even if they're not saying look at me, even if they're having that geek out moment of this is so cool, there is a tendency to want to post that type of stuff. And we really need to, I think it's really important to engage more with stakeholders, consumers and hiring entities, and get their perceptions on these types of things as well.
Okay, so we've got a question from Wendy Ledoux. Don't know if I pronounced that surname right, sorry. Interested in the designation of interpreters being anonymous workers as opposed to the look at me culture. So interpreters can be look at me. For example, some interpreters who work on platform or public events, performance interpreting, as sign language interpreters, are we less anonymous than our spoken language counterparts? Good
I think
question.
that's a really interesting question because just by the nature of the language we work with, just by the modality of it, we're very visual. So we're in the public eye a lot more than a spoken language interpreter would be who may be in a booth. I think what Zweig, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right, I think what he is basically saying though is that those types of jobs are facilitating a greater objective, and it's not about that person specifically. Of course, we are more visible.
Yeah, well, we are a lot more visible, aren't we?
And these kind of questions are why I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and there's a lot more discussion that needs to be had around these concepts so that we can decide as a profession what we want to establish and put forward. Because this isn't something that's going away. Maybe the research I did was on Facebook because it's currently the biggest social networking site in the world, but as one participant very astutely pointed out, if it wasn't Facebook, it would be something else, and one day it will be. So this is going to be a concept that stays with us, and I think the earlier we can kind of decide as a profession what we want to do with it.
I suppose there have been awkward moments when I've logged on and I've seen, let's say, for example, I'm always nervous if someone puts a clip of me on the news on social media, and if someone's going to say something kind of critical about me. But it can happen, and I've seen people have to kind of pull the post down just in case, if you film an interpreter at an event, someone may say something, and that's quite difficult to deal with as well.
I think there's a lot of interesting developments happening in regard to the online domain and interpreting. I know there's been a lot of talk recently about things like 5-star rating systems for interpreters, kind of similar to TripAdvisor and things like that. And
all for it.
It's interesting, but research has also shown that people are more likely to leave negative comments than positive comments. So it's interesting, you know. The digital domain really presents a lot of interesting possibilities.
Questions, yeah.
And questions.
So another question from Jill, or point: we are more in the public eye, but we should still be the way in which the deaf and hearing participants become foregrounded, not us. Good point.
And that would align with Zweig's theory of anonymous work.
Yeah, and then so Katie Smiley, what research has been done about how anonymous accounts are perceived? So I'm thinking of a couple of outspoken anonymous interpreter Twitter accounts.
That would be very interesting. I don't know of any research that has been done in that regard.
You can't really ask them questions, can you?
No,
because they're anonymous. What about you? What do you use social media for? Is it personal or work? Or
it's a bit of both for me. I've noticed since I've done this research, I've probably shifted it more towards a professional lean.
Do you find that then your hearing friends get bored with you and don't want to be on your social media account because all you do is talk about work?
No, I don't know. It's interesting because I was surprised by how often some of these research participants were on Facebook.
Right.
How often they reported being on Facebook. I'm on it maybe once or twice a day. But
right.
So it's interesting how my own social media usage has changed. I think what I have realized is that it's very powerful,
right.
And that I think we all should be able to begin to leverage it more.
So Rachel Mapson, although we're visible at public events, we are there because of what we do, and I think the focus needs to be on what we do, not on us as individuals. I think the postings that make me uncomfortable are the ones that are self-promotion about the individual, not what they are doing, like Jill was saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that definitely aligns with the anonymous work idea. And it also is very interesting because this was the general theme running through the focus groups about interpreters posting about themselves at an event or with a notable person during or after the event, that it generally was not deemed favorably. But what I didn't get from the participants was on what level was it unprofessional? Was it completely unacceptable and it just should not happen at all? Or was it just unfavorable? You know, so it's kind of like it's like, is there a spectrum? Do we say you never, ever, ever do this? But it happens. More research needs to go into how frequently it happens. I see it fairly often myself. And I think if there is more of a shared understanding about professional norms online, then that will perhaps influence how often we see these types of things. If we professionally decide that's really not what we want to see.
It's complex.
It's very complex.
Okay, it looks like I don't have any more questions, so I'm just going to check again. I think that's about it. So is there any questions that you've got for the members that are joining in at home?
I think these questions are very interesting because they really speak to a lot of what's going on. And the difficult thing about doing this research was, even though I specifically asked these kind of questions, it was very hard to get definitive, clear answers on some of the, like the self-promotion thing. But I think more research needs to be done, and I think we just need to be having more of these discussions. And I'm very heartened to see that there is definitely interest in developing some guidelines, because I think that that's something that should happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. That was brilliant. And please send in your feedback. I've had a few questions saying, is it okay to share the slides? I probably shouldn't ask you this slide on there if you had a problem with this, but I'm sure it'd be okay to share the slides.
That's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.